You know, when you look at a typical history textbook, it feels a lot like looking at a random, messy collision of billiard balls.
Oh, yeah. Completely chaotic.
Right, like this empire rises, that king gets angry, a border shifts, a war breaks out. It's all presented as this chaotic sequence of political, geographical, and, economic accidents.
Yeah, chain reaction of geography, resources, and just human ambition.
Yeah.
I mean, it assumes we're essentially making it up as we go along,
Yeah.
reacting blindly to the forces around us.
Exactly. But consider flipping that script entirely. Imagine if human history isn't a series of accidents at all, but like a highly orchestrated, painstakingly curated cosmic curriculum.
Which is a wild concept to wrap your head around.
It really is. And taking it a step further, what if the students in this giant planetary classroom are actually exiled souls from another star system?
Yeah, that's where things get really deep.
So, today, for our deep dive, we are unpacking the sweeping narrative of a 1938 book called A Caminho da Luz, or Towards the Light. It was written by the Brazilian medium Francisco Cândido Xavier, dictated to him by a spirit guide named Emmanuel, and published by the Brazilian Spiritist Federation.
We are diving into an incredibly esoteric alternative history of Earth here. We're going to look at everything from the extinction of prehistoric beasts to the French Revolution through a lens where karma, reincarnation, and cosmic planning actually drive human progress.
Right. But before we get too deep into the weeds, we should probably give a quick disclaimer.
Oh, definitely. It is worth noting that this text contains highly specific spiritual, religious, and political interpretations of history. It offers, very distinct perspectives on the Catholic Church, Islam, the Reign of Terror, and more.
Yeah, and we want to be super clear. We're not taking sides or endorsing these views. We're just looking at the architecture of this specific worldview impartially, exploring the narrative exactly as it's laid out in the original source material.
Exactly. So the foundation of that architecture begins with the physical creation of the Earth itself. The text describes the formation of Earth not as a random clumping of space dust, but as a massive, deliberate project overseen by a community of pure spirits.
And Jesus is acting as what the book calls the divine sculptor.
Right. The level of intentionality described here is just fascinating. Every physical law, every atmospheric pressure was, designed with the future biological vessels in mind.
It's crazy to think about it like that.
Yeah, and the text makes a really specific point about the creation of the moon.
Oh, right, the moon part.
Yeah, it wasn't an accident of a planetary collision, which is, the standard scientific model. It was purposefully designed as a magnetic anchor to balance the Earth.
Wow.
And even more specifically, it was placed there to provide the necessary polarized light to aid in the reproduction of species across all realms of nature.
Okay, let's unpack this cellular construction phase, because the text talks about spiritual workers manipulating protoplasm over millions of years.
Yeah, the basic building blocks.
Right. For anyone whose high school biology is a little rusty, protoplasm is essentially the basic jelly-like substance of living cells, like the raw biological clay of early life.
Exactly.
And the spiritual workers are depicted as slowly molding this clay, but they were actively discarding what the book calls monstrous biological experiments, which clearly alludes to terrifying prehistoric beasts like the dinosaurs.
Yeah, those forms were basically deemed too violent or biologically primitive to house the advanced spirits that were scheduled to arrive.
So they just scrapped them.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
You could think of it as a form of cosmic terraforming. They were preparing delicate biological vessels for a very specific group of inhabitants. And this is where the narrative introduces its major paradigm shift regarding human origins.
This is the big twist.
It is. The source claims that the Adamic races, so the story of Adam and Eve, they are not a literal account of the first humans on Earth.
Right. They're presented as a symbolic memory of millions of rebellious spirits who were exiled from a highly advanced star system, specifically from a world orbiting the star Capella, in the constellation of Auriga.
Yeah, so these beings from Capella, they had reached a point where their intellectual and scientific evolution was incredibly high, but their moral evolution had stagnated.
They were too smart for their own good.
Basically, yeah, they were disrupting the harmony of their homeworld. So the solution was to exile them to a primitive Earth.
It sounds like Earth, in its early days, was set up as a cosmic correctional facility, or like a spiritual rehab center.
A spiritual rehab center, yeah, that's a perfect way to put it.
You have these highly advanced but morally failing beings from Capella sent here completely stripped of their cosmic technology, right? Just to learn humility by reincarnating among Earth's primitive hominids.
Right. And because they brought all that advanced cosmic baggage with them, they didn't just blend into the background. They naturally split into distinct groups
Yeah.
based on their, spiritual tendencies and affinities.
Right, they grouped up.
Yeah. The text explains that these exile groups literally seeded the ancient world's greatest civilizations. So the first group settled in Egypt, and the book describes them as the most advanced and the least burdened by karmic debt.
The Egyptians are characterized as being desperately homesick for Capella, right?
Incredibly homesick.
Yeah, because they remember their cosmic origins more clearly than the others, which explains why their entire culture became so heavily focused on death and the afterlife.
Exactly.
Like, the pyramids wasn't just impressive tombs. The text claims they were built as initiatic temples and as a final monumental message to the future.
Yeah, they supposedly embedded advanced mathematical and astronomical data in the stone before this specific group successfully redeemed themselves and returned to the stars.
Wow, so they actually got to go home.
They did.
Yeah.
But it also provides a psychological explanation for ancient religious beliefs, which I found really interesting.
Oh, the animal reincarnation thing?
Yeah, metempsychosis. The source claims that the Egyptian belief that a human soul could devolve and reincarnate as an animal was actually born out of the trauma of their cosmic downgrade.
That makes so much sense in this context.
Right. They remembered falling from a highly advanced state to a primitive, restricted biological form, and that trauma sort of morphed over generations into the fearful myth of devolving into animals.
But not all the Capellan exiles were ready to graduate and go home. Another major group settled in India,
Right.
and the book states they brought with them high spiritual science, which eventually became the Vedas.
Yeah. But the tragedy of the group in India, according to the text, is that they succumbed to the exact same pride that got them exiled from Capella in the first place.
Of course.
Their deep intellectual pride led them to create the oppressive caste system. They viewed the indigenous human spirits, like the actual primitive earthlings, as pariahs, untouchables, and completely refused to fraternize with them.
Okay, hold on. I am trying to square this logic. If these Capellan exiles were supposedly so spiritually evolved that they could write the Vedas, how do they instantly create oppressive castes and institutionalize inequality? Like, what is the fatal flaw the text is pointing to here?
That tension is central to the entire narrative. The source draws a hard line between intellectual advancement and moral advancement.
So they aren't the same thing.
Not at all.
No.
You can possess a deep understanding of cosmic spiritual science, yet still be deeply arrogant, selfish, and completely lacking in empathy.
Wow.
Yeah. Their fatal flaw was pride. The intellect was highly evolved, but the heart was corrupted. They understood the mechanics of the universe, but lacked the humility to treat lesser evolved beings as equals.
That distinction changes how we view progress entirely. I mean, if you think about it. And then now if we look at a third group, the exiles who formed Israel, we see a completely different reaction to the earth environment.
Yeah, very different.
The text describes them as fiercely monotheistic and faithful, but deeply isolationist. And it frames Moses in a very specific light.
Not just as a lawgiver.
Right, not just a lawgiver, but as an extraordinary medium. He reportedly took the secret, highly guarded esoteric knowledge of the Egyptian temples and simplified it for the masses.
While Israel isolated itself to preserve its faith, the fourth group took the opposite approach. The Indo-Europeans, or the Aryans, they're described as the most rebellious of all the exiles.
The troublemakers.
Exactly. They lacked the deep religious memory of the Hindus or the Egyptians, focusing heavily on rationalism, practical science, and political organization.
But they did something crucial that the group in India refused to do. They assimilated.
Yes, that's the key difference.
They intermarried and fraternized with the primitive earthlings, mixing their advanced spiritual lineage with the raw biology of the earth. And according to the text, this willingness to blend is what laid the vital groundwork for modern Western civilization.
The text also touches on China, framing it as an incredibly ancient, homogeneous civilization that eventually stagnated.
Oh, why did they stagnate?
Well, the reason given is that they isolated themselves and fundamentally misunderstood the concept of nirvana.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, treating it as a state of inactive nothingness
Yeah.
rather than a dynamic, active harmony with the universe.
This brings us to a massive turning point in the curriculum. By analyzing the successes and failures of these ancient groups, the spiritual guides overseeing Earth saw a crisis.
A huge crisis.
Human intellect, inherited from Capella, was producing philosophy, architecture, and complex law. But human morality was failing miserably.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the cosmic curriculum required intervention. And we see this play out in Greece and Rome, leading up to the arrival of Jesus.
Right.
In Greece, the text contrasts Athens and Sparta. Athens is praised as the cradle of democracy, art, and philosophy. Sparta, however, is heavily criticized for its militaristic, state-controlled society.
It's all about the state over the individual.
Exactly. The source draws a direct line between Sparta and modern totalitarianism, where the state completely suppresses the individual soul.
And then in Athens, we get Socrates. The book highlights him as a direct precursor to Jesus, sent by the spiritual realms to prepare the intellectual ground of the world by teaching about virtue and the immortal soul.
Yeah.
And naturally, the political establishment couldn't handle the disruption, and he was executed.
Naturally. Then there is Rome. The text notes that Rome started with noble family virtues, heavily influenced by the Etruscans. But they slowly descended into the bloody intoxication of imperialism and the abuse of power.
Which is such a tragedy.
It really is, because the source views the Roman Empire as a spiritual assignment, not just a political entity. Rome had the unprecedented opportunity to unite the entire globe peacefully through law, education, and infrastructure. They were given the tools to build a unified human family.
Instead, they chose the sword. They chose oppression, slavery, and the bloodlust of the Colosseum, generating a massive collective karmic debt. And because Rome failed to unite the world through love, the spiritual intervention had to escalate. According to the text, this is why Jesus incarnated physically. He's described as a revolutionary of love who completely rejected wealth, status, and political power.
Yeah, and the Jewish elite at the time rejected him because they were expecting a worldly, conquering king to overthrow Rome, not a humble carpenter teaching radical forgiveness.
But the tragedy, according to the narrative, didn't end at the crucifixion. The early Christians were pure, dedicated martyrs. But the text points to a massive spiritual catastrophe that occurred a few centuries later.
The merging of the church with the Roman state.
Exactly. The establishment of the papacy, which the text dates to 607 AD, is heavily criticized here. The source argues that by adopting the imperialistic, dominating spirit of the fallen Roman Empire, the institutional church became the very thing it was supposed to spiritually heal.
It's a total reversal.
Yeah. The pursuit of earthly political power and wealth is framed as a profound betrayal of Jesus' teachings. The book even goes so far as to mathematically link the Latin titles of the Pope-like Vicarius Filii Dei and Dux Cleri to the apocalyptic number 666, using Roman numeral values.
It is a stark condemnation of dogma prioritizing empire over empathy. And Rome eventually collapsed under its own immense karmic weight, plunging humanity into the Middle Ages.
The Dark Ages.
Right. But the source frames the Dark Ages not as a tragic accident of history, but as a deliberate spiritual timeout.
A timeout. I love that. Feudalism is described as a forced return to nature and the soil. It was a necessary school of reflection and hard labor for souls that had become too arrogant, violent, and drunk on the excesses of empire.
Yeah, you can't be a haughty patrician plotting assassinations when you're forced to till the land just to survive the winter.
Exactly. But eventually, humanity had to reconnect to continue evolving.
Right. And the text claims the Crusades, despite being incredibly bloody and, totally anti-Christian in their actual spirit, were utilized by spiritual guides to break that feudal isolation.
Oh, wow.
The conflict forced the East and the West to interact again, sparking trade, the flow of ideas, and basically setting the stage for the Renaissance.
But the European continent was still deeply bogged down in millennia of karmic debt. I mean, you had the horrors of the Inquisition, endless religious wars, and deep-seated hatreds between nations. Think of it like crop rotation in agriculture.
That's a good analogy.
The spiritual guides realized the soil of Europe was completely depleted and poisoned by thousands of years of bloodshed. You couldn't plant the seeds of a new society there. So they designated a completely untouched field.
The Americas.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The colonization of the Americas wasn't just a rush for resources. It was an orchestrated spiritual migration.
Yeah, the text explicitly claims that the spiritual planes designed a geographical division of labor here.
A division of labor.
Yes, the United States was intended to be the brain of this new civilization embodying material power, establishing the infrastructure of democracy and driving scientific progress.
Okay, the brain.
Right. And Brazil was specifically designed to be the heart, the center of spiritual power, tasked with blending cultures and races to cultivate empathy and religious synthesis for the future.
Meanwhile, back in the depleted soil of Europe, the French Revolution erupts. The philosophers initially brought in noble ideas of liberty and human rights, but the text says that dark, vengeful spirits from the invisible plane hijacked the revolution, twisting it into the reign of terror.
It is important to understand the mechanics of this hijacking.
Yeah, how does a spirit hijack a revolution?
Well, the text suggests the unseen spiritual world is deeply intertwined with ours. So when a mob becomes legitimately angry about inequality, lower vibrational spirits essentially discarnate humans who are still hateful, vengeful, or power-hungry. They flock to that energy. They don't necessarily possess people. They amplify the paranoia and whisper to human anger, turning a push for liberty into blind bloodlust and the guillotine.
And out of that chaos emerges Napoleon. The book describes him not just as a brilliant general, but as a spiritual missionary sent to reorganize society and spread those liberal ideals across Europe. But he failed his assignment.
Massively.
He allowed vanity and imperialism to consume him, causing widespread devastation instead of liberation.
And this reboot in the Americas and the intense political upheavals in Europe basically set the stage for the modern world. Entering the 19th century, the text highlights massive shifts. The explosion of modern science, the abolition of slavery, which it calls a spiritually guided victory for human liberty, and the birth of socialism.
The book's perspective on socialism is quite nuanced, actually. It acknowledges it as a valid attempt to seek equality and justice for the working class. But it criticizes the movement for missing the fundamental necessity of inner moral reform.
Which ties back to the whole intellect versus morality thing.
Exactly. The logic is that you can redistribute wealth and flatten hierarchies all you want, but if the human heart remains greedy and proud, the system will eventually fail, and new forms of oppression will simply replace the old ones.
Yeah. And because humanity was progressing so rapidly in science and politics during the 19th century, it was at serious risk of losing its soul to pure materialism.
People were leaving religion behind.
Right. The spiritual realm recognized that religious dogma was no longer satisfying the intellectual minds of the era, so they sent another major intervention.
In 1804, a prominent French educator named Hippolyte Léon Denisard Revel is born. He didn't start as a mystic, by the way. He was an academic who approached the era's seance phenomena like a skeptical scientist.
Very analytical.
Yeah, and he eventually took the pen name Allan Kardec, and his work codifying Spiritism is identified in the text as the arrival of the promised comforter that Jesus predicted in the Gospels.
Spiritism's role, according to the text, is to bridge the widening gap between rational, empirical science and original Christianity. It aims to explain the actual mechanics of reincarnation and the law of compensation, or karma. It essentially provides a logical framework for suffering.
Right. It teaches humans why they suffer and how to evolve, relying on individual spiritual effort rather than extreme political ideologies or, utopias of absolute equality.
And this creates a lens of profound responsibility. If you truly internalize the idea that you are an immortal spirit, currently enrolled in a physical school to learn love and eradicate pride, your reaction to the modern world changes.
Absolutely.
Information overload stops being a source of panic and becomes a curriculum to be navigated with discernment. Societal chaos isn't just a sign of the end times. It's the friction required for collective karmic debt to be paid and for a more empathetic society to be forged. It demands focusing on your own inner reform first, rather than forcing external compliance on others.
Let's pull all these threads together. According to this deeply fascinating text, we are not biological accidents spinning on a rock. We are cosmic students in a spiritually curated school.
Yeah.
From the exile of those proud souls, from Capella to the construction of the pyramids, from the fall of Rome to the founding of the Americas, every major historical shift is a deliberate lesson in karma and evolution. History isn't a chaotic collision of billiard balls. It's a masterfully played game of cosmic chess, designed entirely to teach us how to love.
It reframes our understanding of progress completely. I mean, true civilization isn't measured by technological output or political dominance. It is measured by the expansion of the human heart and the reduction of our collective ego.
I want to leave you with something to chew on that builds on everything we've just explored. If Earth truly is an evolutionary school for spirits trying to learn love and overcome their own pride, what does that mean for your everyday life?
That's the real question.
Right. The next time you face a frustrating conflict at work, a difficult family dynamic, or a societal crisis on the news that makes your blood boil, ask yourself, Is this just random bad luck? Or is it a perfectly tailored, millennia in the making karmic exam designed to test exactly how much you've grown? Think about that the next time you look at a history book.